International Monetary Fund still sounding warnings to everyone out there about the state of the global financial system. But there's also a lot of warnings going on to fiscal policymakers about what we should do to avoid the deceleration in the global financial market and the economies. That's part of what was talked about yesterday at the World Bank IMF annual meetings in Washington. Let's take a listen to one of the directors at the IMF.
Fiscal policy plays a central role in, for example, managing the synchronized slowdown in the global economy, preparing for downside risks, contributing to financial stability, financing the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals, and finally, in addressing climate change, which is the topic of the fiscal monitor this time. Major economies should be prepared for coordinated action in case of a downturn. Moreover, inflation and inflation expectations are drifting below target, and interest rates are negative in many advanced economies. Hence, the time is now for countries with budgetary room to use it to support aggregate demand. In most other economies, however, monetary policy is not constrained. Public debt and interest-to-tax ratios are high and rising. Therefore, we advise policymakers to follow prudent fiscal policies anchored by a medium-term framework. Otherwise, as often happened in the past, complacency fueled by low interest rates will lead to overborrowing, followed by investors' panic and financial markets disruptions. Sovereign bond yields are negative across the maturity spectrum in most advanced economies. We are now deep into zero or negative territory. Further decreases in policy interest rates are limited. This contrasts with the situation just before the global financial crisis. In emerging markets and low-income developing countries, public debt ratios are high and rising. The cost of servicing debt is also increasing, unlike advanced economies where low interest rates have compensated for high debt levels. Some countries are vulnerable to exchange and interest rate shocks. In China, the largest emerging market economy, we expect the economic slowdown and fiscal stimulus to widen the deficit. We recommend that fiscal policy helps dampen the negative impact on growth from trade disputes and that it supports the long-term rebalancing of the Chinese economy. Fiscal policy has an important role to play in the development agendas of many countries, which need to substantially raise spending to meet the Sustainable Development Goals by 2030, particularly low-income developing economies. The spending must be framed in the context of a comprehensive growth and development strategy. Building tax capacity is necessary to enable the state to deliver on its functions for inclusive and sustainable development. Efficiency in spending is a crucial aspect of good governance. It is also necessary to ensure complementarities between public finance, private investment, and official development assistance. So let me now turn your attention to the fiscal monitor on climate change. By simply looking at me, you can notice a very important thing. I'm holding a leaflet. Why is it that I'm holding a leaflet? Because the fiscal monitor is now fully digital. It's fully paperless. And so it contributes to limiting global warming. It's important to realize that current pledges under the Paris Agreement are not enough. They will limit global warming to 3 degrees Celsius. This is well above the safe level. To limit global warming to 2 degrees Celsius or less, the level deemed safe by scientists, fiscal policy must be mobilized, and governments and finance ministers need to take further substantial action. How much more? Each country would have to take measures that are as ambitious as our carbon tax implemented now and rising to $75 per ton by 2030. Countries may choose to take other options. We discuss various possible combinations of measures in the monitor. Nevertheless, the $75 carbon tax provides one measure of the degree of ambition which is required to deliver on the Paris goals. What would this entail? If the carbon tax of $75 per ton were implemented globally, China and India would account for almost 70% of CO2 reductions among G20 economies compared with a no-action scenario. This reflects the dominant role of coal in the production of energy in China and India. The carbon tax would lead to higher prices for consumers. For retail electricity, for example, price increases would vary from 2% in France to 89% in South Africa. The average increase would be 45%. The differences largely reflect the role of coal in generating energy in each country. The goal is to reshape the tax system and fiscal policy more generally to discourage emissions. It is crucial that the additional revenues from carbon taxation are used appropriately to reduce burdens and make the reform more politically acceptable. The fiscal monitor presents several options involving, for example, labor tax cuts, payments to households, and public investment. And for a further discussion, please don't forget to consult the fiscal monitor. So to wrap up, fiscal policy is at the center of the economic policy debate today. In fact, fiscal policy plays a central role in, for example, managing the synchronized slowdown in the global economy, preparing for downside risks, contributing to financial stability, financing the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals, and finally, in addressing climate change.